super rich, right? Much richer than they ever were before, due to this expansion. Okay? So one, you get kind of the plunder or treasure that you capture when you're expanding. But even after, right, you're done with the military conquest and you've got an empire, senators at the very top of Rome's social status are going to be the ones who are chosen for provincial administration, right? We talked about that in the last class. Development of provinces that are going to be ruled by governors. So this is going to be an opportunity again for senators to, shall we say, find profit in the imperial enterprise. Equestrians, right? So again, kind of one half step down, are often going to be in charge of tax collection for the empire. And the way that taxes work in the Roman Empire is that the Senate is in charge, and you would make a bid about how much in taxes you could collect from a certain province. So say we're talking about the province of Sicily, right? You get 3 people bid. One person would say, oh, I can get $1,000 in taxes. Someone else would say, oh, I can get $2,000 in taxes. Someone else would say, oh, I can get $3,000 in taxes. So then the Senate would award the contract to someone, probably the guy that said they could get $3,000. Then this person would go and basically, they could pretty much tax the people however they wanted. They would owe the Senate $3,000. And basically anything over $3,000 they were able to collect was their profit, was their payment for collecting taxes. Now again, recipe for disaster, right? You can see how this can go horribly wrong, and it will go horribly wrong in many ways, right? But this is the system that was set up, right? And so again, people are going to use this as a way of profiting from the empire. The last thing is a good chunk of the land, especially in Italy and nearby, that was conquered by Rome, was held by the government. And this was called ager publicus, public land, right? But not public like a park, like public like owned by the government, not by an individual. And then the government would lease it out to individuals at pretty low rates to use and exploit. Who do you think the government is leasing it out to? Roman elites, right? So they're going to be leased the ager publicus at low rates. They could then farm the land, right? Profit from the produce. More on that in a second. All right. So really, what it means is, as a result of imperialism, right? Lots of money is coming into Rome as a whole, but the elites, the people at the top, are going to be wealthier and more powerful than ever. Okay. Questions here? No questions here. All right. Okay. So everyone sees the connection between having an empire and profiting. All right. Okay. Good. All right. So let's turn to our first primary source. So what I'd like you to do is pull up primary source 24. Or I should say primary source, right? Because this is written by a later historian, by Appian. But again, it's one of our best sources for this crisis. Okay? And so what I'd like you to do, either by yourself or if you'd like to work with a partner, whichever you prefer, to review the first paragraph that's on page 1 and page 2. Right? And think about these questions up here. Okay? So let's take about 8 minutes to look over the paragraph, to think about these questions, and then we will talk about them. take 2 more minutes and we'll talk about the paragraph. Okay, let's talk about the paragraph here. All right, so what is Appian talking about here in this first paragraph? What's the events that he's talking about here?
So he's talking about the spoils of Rome, as they conquer, as like they fight these wars, they're getting new land,
Mm-hmm.
and they're giving the land to the wealthy people, and how those wealthy people. He's basically describing how the wealthy people are getting rich
Mm-hmm.
by using slave labor over free people for work.
So which land is he talking about specifically here? Like where is the land that he's really focusing on? Italy, right? So again, they're defeating the Italian tribes. They take control of this Ager Publicus. Anyone who wants to use it can, if they, basically give a percentage to the state. But as Johan said, right, basically it ends up being the wealthy that end up holding the land, right? But they are acquiring the land for themselves. They're buying up land that's nearby that might belong to someone else. And what ends up happening, right, is that the wealthy are building these large kind of plantation-like estates, right? And who's working the land? Johan said, slave labor, right? Why not have your kind of free tenants work the land, the people that you bought the land from? Why not, Jeremy?
Free laborers might be drafted from agriculture to the army.
Right. Okay. Again, so there's a chance that if you're a free Roman citizen, right, you owe military service. So you could lose your laborers to army draft. But if you're using enslaved persons, right, no such fear. Okay? So why is this situation problematic then? Why is it?
Because first of all, the land was meant to go to the Italians.
Sort of, yeah. It was supposed to be for kind of the Italian people, yeah.
But now, since the rich Romans were able to just take the land and do slave labor, the Italians were decreased in numbers and vigor,
Mm-hmm.
and were held down as they were in poverty, taxes, and military service.
Okay, right, okay. So it's kind of diminishing the Italian population, right? You might ask, well, why is that a big deal? Well, this is not mentioned here, but gets picked up later. Oh, Anthony?
Yeah, you can't fight the wars because there's less population.
Right. Because remember when we were looking at the Hannibal War, we looked at the military figures, right? We said, okay, well, which in our last class, and who's fighting there? And it said there were 20,000 Romans and 40,000 Italian allies, or something like that. And so the Italian allies are a big part of Rome's military forces. And if their population is going down, fewer people to serve in the army, fewer people to fight. Okay? So this is at the heart of the crisis of the Republic. Okay, so Rome operated what we think of as kind of a militia-style military, right? Wasn't really full-time soldiers. Citizens would be called up to duty during campaign season. They would go off and fight for a couple months. They would come back and pick up their jobs as usual. This works pretty well when over kind of relatively short distances. So when the Romans, for example, are fighting in Italy, it's not necessarily a huge problem. But as we talked about in the last class, right, as Rome's expanding, right, their fighting is taking place in areas further and further away, which means more time to get transported out there, right? Possibly a longer campaign in the field, and then more time to get transported back. All of a sudden, it makes sense, well, don't come back at the end of the campaign season. Stay out there, in a base, in a fort, until the next season, and it comes time to fight. Anthony?
They also probably don't know the land as well.
They don't know that's probably true, but that's going to be perceived as being less of the issue, right? The big part of the issue is that soldiers are spending more and more time under arms in service. And this means if they're spending more time doing that, what are they spending less time doing?
I think we left time on the farm.
Spending less time on the farm, right? The main occupation for both Romans and Italians, right? Going to be working the land, going to be farmers, right? Again, not servants necessarily, right? But again, people that are, working large family farms by themselves, right? That still requires kind of family labor to not only take care of themselves, but provide the funds they need for the arms and armor, right? So if no one's working the farm, or if you're losing, a couple bodies from the family, right? It's not like that work automatically gets made up. So you can't harvest the crops, which means you're going to have less money. Okay? So let's look at primary source 23. Here we get a speech supposedly written or supposedly given by a Roman by the name of Spurius Ligustinus. And this was given allegedly in 171 BCE, right? This is at the point where Rome is fighting campaigns all throughout the Mediterranean, primarily in Greece and Macedonia, but also to the west. So, he says, citizens of Rome, I, Spurius Ligustinus, I, Spurius Ligustinus, of the tribe Crustumina, and I come from Sabine stock. My father left me an acre of land and a little hut in which I was born and brought up. I'm still living there today. As soon as I came of age, my father gave me his brother's daughter to wife, which brought nothing with her save her free birth and her chastity, together with a fertility which would be enough even for a wealthy home. We have 6 sons and 2 daughters, both already married. 4 of my sons have taken the toga of manhood, 2 are still underage. So there's his family. I joined the army in the consulship of Publius Sulpicius and Gaius Aurelius Cotta in 200 BCE, and I served 2 years in the ranks of the army, which was taken across to Macedonia in the campaign against King Philip V of Macedonia. This is the Second Macedonian War. In the 3rd year, Titus Quinctius Flaminius promoted me for my bravery to be centurion of the 10th Maniple of Infantry. Right? So he's fighting over here in Macedonia. Right? Okay. After the defeat of King Philip and the Macedonians, when we were brought back to Italy and demobilized, I immediately left for Spain as a volunteer with the consul Marcus Porcius Cato in 195. Of all the living generals, none has been a keener observer and judge of bravery than he, as is well known to those who through long military service have had experience with him and other commanders. This general judged me worthy to be appointed centurion of the 1st century of infantry. I enlisted for a 3rd time, again as a volunteer, in the army sent against the Aetolians, back to Greece, right, this is the Aetolian League, and King Antiochus. Manius Achilles Glabrio, 191, appointed me centurion for the 1st century of the Principes. When King Antiochus had been driven out and when the Aetolians had been crushed, we were brought back to Italy. And twice after that, I took part in the campaigns in which the legion served for a year. Thereafter, I saw 2 campaigns in Spain, here, right? One with Quintus Fulvius Flaccus as praetor, the other with Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus in command. I was brought back home by Flaccus with the others, whom he brought back with him from the province for his triumph on account of their bravery. And then I returned to Spain because I was asked to again by Tiberius Gracchus. 4 times in the course of a few years, I held the rank of chief centurion. 34 times I was rewarded for bravery by his generals. I've been given 6 civic crowns. I've completed 22 years of service in the army, and I'm now over 50 years old. But even if I had not completed my service, and if my age did not give me exemption, it would still be right for me to be discharged, Publius Licinius, since I could give you 4 soldiers as my substitutes. There was an official vote of thanks, and the military tribunes, on account of his bravery, appointed him 1st centurion of the 1st Legion. The other centurions withdrew their appeal and obediently responded for the call to conscription. So basically, this was a speech about why he shouldn't be drafted again, right? And he talks about his bravery and his service. But think about how much time he spent in the army and where he was serving, right? Back and forth between kind of Greece, Italy, Spain for, 22 years. What's he not doing for large chunks of that time? Working his small farm, right? Now again, he's like, well, I've got 4 sons, 2 are still underage. That means that they're still under 14 at this point that he's giving the speech after 23 years, right? The other sons and daughters are older, they're helping and stuff, but again, taking out kind of one of the adults from the farm is going to make it difficult for the farm to survive, right? So again, this is the type of service that imperialism requires, right? More time in the army, traveling over greater distances. Anyway.
So each person gets about 300 acres. I did my readings and I think it specifically said 300 acres. That's a lot.
It can be. I mean, again, it depends on, it doesn't always get allocated out fairly. If you're talking about the Ager Publicus, right? All right, so on top of that, so you've got kind of army service, soldiers don't have as much time to farm, means family farms are suffering. Same time, we get influx of wealth and enslaved persons, right? So war and war captives are going to prove to be a very cheap source of enslaved persons. And the Romans have been fighting lots of wars and taking lots of captives. So now, you've got very rich elites. You've got a large number of enslaved persons who can be purchased relatively cheaply. So, the elites not only control the Ager Publicus, which we already talked about, but are also purchasing the land of destitute soldiers whose families basically can't produce enough to survive, to build these large tracts of land, or these large kind of estates. These large estates, called in Latin latifundii, right? As Appian noted, they're going to be staffed by enslaved workers, right? And so what we see is with Roman imperialism comes the growth of chattel slavery in Rome. So we talked about chattel slavery in ancient Greece. Does anyone remember what chattel slavery means? Abdul?
It's like using slavery as goods.
Right. As good in what way? Or for what reason? What's the focus of slavery? Which might sound odd if you haven't studied the history of slavery, but what's the focus in chattel slavery?
They're treated basically as property that can be bought and sold.
Right. And why is that?
Economic benefit.
Economic benefit because?
There are no wages to pay.
True, but that's also because, that's also true of slavery kind of worldwide. Chattel slavery, right, it's economic benefit because the institution of slavery is also embedded in the economy, right? So one of the reasons why, not just that enslaved persons are bought and sold, but they're seen as a valuable commodity, is because slavery itself is not like an institution of prestige or even personal service, right? It is driving the Roman economy. In this case, it's driving the Roman economy through these latifundia. Okay, is there a question or Ron? Question or no? Anything?
So, so would they have, so would they have like more rights, like compared to the state? Like, would the
Who's they?
state check up on them? Like,
Who's they?
I'm talking about the slaves.
No. They had no rights and no protections. Yeah. Which then leads us to our next source, right? So, slavery, which it existed in Rome in kind of a small scale, right, becomes embedded in the economy, grows to kind of a huge number of size, right? And again, we're going to have large estates, large tracts of land, right, embedded with large numbers of enslaved workers, which is also then going to lead to another crisis, which comes from the conditions on the estates, right, and basically the resistance of enslaved persons. So this brings us to our next source, 25, Diodorus Siculus, which is an account of the first large-scale revolt of enslaved persons on the island of Sicily. So Sicily, too, was made up of these large latifundia. All right, so everyone take a couple seconds and review this. And the question is, what can this tell us, again, about the working conditions on latifundia and the resistance of enslaved persons? All right, so what does Diodorus tell us about the working conditions for enslaved persons in Sicily? What do we learn? Chris, did you have something?
Yeah. They were basically like, they were barely treated as human. They were only given
Okay.
the bare minimum of like food and clothing. And they were basically just like, they were only there just to be working, and they were
Right.
basically
Okay.
worked themselves near death. And
Right. Okay. Right. So again, so harsh working conditions. Right. Treated with a heavy hand. Not really fed or taken care of. Right. That's good. Jeremy.
Because they had no resources, they basically turned to becoming bandits.
Right. Becoming bandits. So to get food, in addition to doing the work, right, they basically acted as armed bandits. Right. Which again tells us something, though. Right. What does it tell us about enslaved persons? Just in general, if you're able to work as a bandit.
I'm guessing you're worried about like, well, that well surveilled, I guess. 'Cause-
Right, okay, right. That's it. That there's some freedom of movement, right? Access to weaponry that's not really, so there's some kind of independence of movement that's going to allow them to act as brigands, and Diodorus almost seems to imply that it's almost encouraged, right? Because then the enslavers don't have to pay for their maintenance. And in fact, why doesn't the Sicilian governor, right? Why don't they take action against the brigands, the enslaved persons?
Didn't they have positions in the government?
Who's they?
I'm talking about what do you call it? The slave owners.
Right. Yeah. So the enslavers, like the enslavers themselves, are so powerful, right, and influential. They were afraid to kind of take action against, the enslaved brigands, right? Because they didn't want to upset the enslavers. Brian?
And just to add on to that as well, there's also the greater need for permission and to do anything against the slaves. I mean, I gained permission from the slave owners themselves in order for the government to do something. And since these slave owners were so influential.
Right. And the slave owners, they don't want anything done, right? Because again, these enslaved persons are their source of labor for their estates, right? So again, this is going to erupt in kind of the source goes on to describe a first massive rebellion, right? Where the groups of enslaved persons are going to gather together and form an army and basically rise up against Roman authorities and be moderately successful at first until being basically decimated by the Roman army. All right. So, the crisis of the Republic is in many ways an army crisis. Right? The length of service required for, kind of building this widespread empire makes citizens less willing to serve, right? Spurius Longustinus, even though he was willing to serve for a long time, right? It's kind of done. And the economic crisis makes citizens unable to serve, right? Remember, you need X amount of money in order to buy your own arms and armor to serve in the army, right? So destitute Romans and Italians means not enough citizens who meet the wealth criteria to purchase their arms and weapons, which means not enough soldiers. Okay? So not only is it shrinking population, but shrinking number of people who can afford to serve in the military. All right. So this brings us to the issue of land reform. It's going to be raised by a famous Roman, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, right? He says, look, Rome depends on its army. Rome was built with its army, right? And Rome's army is disappearing, right? The bedrock of Rome are the citizen soldiers. And without their land, they don't exist. Roman armies don't exist, right? We're going to become weakened by this. So again, his proposal is couched in terms of strengthening Rome by strengthening its army, by strengthening the citizen soldiers. So, 133, he is elected as tribune of the plebs. Okay, who remembers what's the tribune of the plebs?
It's a representative for the plebeians.
Right? And what was the job of the tribune of the plebs?
They'd also veto.
They had the right to veto. What does veto mean?
Like
Object.
Block?
Yes, block like a law
Or any type of kind of government action.
yeah.
Right? And again, done ostensibly to protect the interests of the plebeians. All right, go ahead.
So is it considered an objection?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, but it's can't be overruled, theoretically. Or it's not supposed to be overruled, theoretically. Right? Okay, so he gets elected tribune of the plebs. Another important thing about the tribune of the plebs is that they can introduce legislation to the council of the plebs. And if you remember 2 classes ago, right, the council of the plebs, what they pass now has the force of law in Rome, right? So he uses his position to pass a land reform bill. This will limit how much of the agri publicus one individual, one Roman can possess, right? So this is aimed at breaking up these elite blocks and then all the land that's reclaimed, right, will be reapportioned to poorer Romans. How do you think the rich elite Romans are going to feel about this?
Trouble?
Yes. Well, I should say, I mean, he's also a rich elite Roman, so not everyone, but a lot of the elite Romans are not going to be happy about this because, again, this is cutting into the source of their wealth and power. Okay, so 2 critical points happen with this land reform bill. So he introduces the bill, right? It passes. But it passes after another tribune, one of his colleagues, because there was 10, first vetoes the bill. So in theory, then, the bill is not supposed to go forward. But Gracchus asserts that this other tribune's veto wasn't valid because he wasn't acting in the interests of the plebeians. If he was acting in the interests of the plebeians, then he wouldn't have voted to against the land reform bill. Now again, this is not technically a legit argument that someone can make, right? The veto is supposed to stand on its own, but Gracchus makes the argument and basically gets the other tribune removed, just under kind of threat of force. So that's problematic issue number 1. Problematic issue number 2 is then he announces he's going to run for tribune again the next year. There's nothing technically in the rules that says that he can't do this, but he's not supposed to do it. It's supposed to be something that happens maybe after a long period of time. Okay. But he announces, I'm going to run for tribune next year. So basically this is going to break up, it's going to lead to rioting between the factions that are kind of supporting Gracchus and those who are more conservative. Gracchus is killed. His land reform will go forward still because it passed, but it's going to be neutered kind of by the ruling powers, and it has kind of limited impact at first. Okay, questions here? Okay, everyone sees how this is a attempt to respond to the crisis, right? We're going to create more land for landless Romans. This is going to prop up our army. Okay, so Tiberius gets murdered. He has a little brother by the name of Gaius Gracchus. About 10 years later, 123, he will be elected tribune of the plebs, right? He gets elected, again, on a very broad economic reform platform, right? So his older brother was just land reform. Gaius talks about land reform, right? Kind of like furthering kind of the neutered effort that was in place after his brother, but also things like providing subsidized grain for the poorest Roman citizens, building new roads to make it easier for non-wealthy people to travel to Rome. So again, trying to kind of overcome kind of the traditional ways of doing things. He will then run for tribune again, like his brother does, the next year, and he gets elected. So again, not supposed to do this, and his enemies start, kind of stating that Gaius Gracchus is attempting to make himself king. Bad word, right? In Rome, kings are bad. So he's trying to use the office of tribune to kind of seize sole power in Rome. That year passes. He then stands for election for a 3rd year in a row. This year, right, he runs but doesn't win. Right? His supporters basically announce fraud. They erupt into violence, and there's rioting throughout the city. So, in response to the violence, the Senate uses one of its powers, and this is called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum. So this is one of the emergency powers that the Senate has, that it can basically empower the consuls, the magistrates, to take kind of drastic steps or whatever's necessary to protect the Republic. So, the consuls are empowered, and basically with this power they have Gaius and many of his supporters killed outright without any type of trial or anything like that. So ending the kind of riots, quote unquote, to protect the safety of the Republic.
They don't have ostracism here, right?
They don't have ostracism.
Good concept.
I mean, they had, you could go into exile as like a criminal punishment, but not the idea of ostracism like in Athens now.
Pretty good concept to apply here.
You know, maybe? Maybe? All right, questions? All right, no, all right. So, this brings us to our next person, Gaius Marius, who was a wealthy equestrian, right? So he was elite, but not quite the super ultimate elite, right? But he's going to gain attention through his military skill. So a natural born leader in general, right? He's going to be recognized as a talented officer. He then gains the patronage of one of the important Roman families, the Caecilii Metelli. Okay, so who remembers what patronage is? We talked about this.
Like, getting favors from people, and in return you give a favor.
Right. And what's kind of the defining feature of the two people? There's something about their relationship or their status in patronage.
It's a different status.
Different statuses, right? So again, that's kind of the key part too. So it's not people that like doing favors for people that are equal, doing favors for, between people that are unequal, right? So the Caecilii Metelli, right, feel that like, okay, we want to support him because then he can work on our behalf, or if he wins victories, we get some of the prestige from it, yada, yada, yada. So they throw their support behind him. They help him to become a senator, right? So to rise up to the most elite level. And he will serve as a quaestor and a praetor, so kind of the stepping stones of the Roman cursus honorum, right? The kind of the magistracies. So in the year 108, the Romans are fighting a war in North Africa against King Jugurtha of Numidia. Down here, red arrow. So the Numidians had been allies of Rome in their last fight against Carthage, which was up here, right? But in the next few decades, right, there's going to be some growing tensions. Now the fight is on. A member of the Caecilii Metelli family, Quintus Caecilius Metellus, is the consul. He is in charge of the army fighting here in Numidia, and he brings Marius along as one of his officers, one of his legates. While they are fighting there in Numidia, right, Marius kind of gets permission to leave, to return to Rome, and to run for the office of consul. Metellus is somewhat wary about this, but he's given kind of the opportunity to go back, and he wins. At this point, he then voices some very, what's the word I'm looking for?
Controversial.
Not controversial, I was going to say,
Heavy?
he doesn't hold back, shall we say, non-diplomatic concerns about how the war against Jugurtha is going. Now you remember, who's leading the war against Jugurtha? Basically one of his patrons, right? So he basically gets permission to go back to Rome to run for consul, kind of grudgingly is allowed to do it. So he leaves, go back, right? Wins, and then basically is like, oh, this is going horribly here. The Roman general in charge is doing a horrible job. We're in danger of losing. At which point, he gets a tribune of the plebs to introduce legislation into the plebeian council to have Quintus Caecilius Metellus replaced by Marius, which again is not something that's supposed to be done. That military commands are supposed to come from the Senate, given to magistrates or former magistrates, right? So even though Marius is a magistrate now that he's a consul, the Senate is supposed to kind of apportion out commands, right? But he basically gets it done through plebiscite. So, does things non-traditional and perhaps illegal way. So, Marius is going to serve as commander of the Roman army against Jugurtha. The problem is, is that the Senate also kind of controls troop allocations. So like, okay, fine, you somehow wormed your way into command. Good luck doing this without an army. So, Marius engages in a program of army reform, which he is going to get passed through the Council of the Plebs. So, this is his plan, right? And again, he gets enough political support to get it passed and get it implemented. For the first time, Rome is going to enlist volunteers from the lowest class of Romans, the capitae censi, right? They were called the head count, right? The people that were too poor to serve in the army because they couldn't afford armor and weapons, right? And this class had been growing bigger and bigger and bigger over the last few decades due to the land crisis, right? So more and more people who were too poor to serve in the army. So Marius's reform, right, which again, he gets passed through kind of the official channels, is that these enlisted soldiers will get provided weapons by the state and will also be paid a salary, right? So again, both of these are firsts. This is the creation of really Rome's first professional army, right? Where you'll have people whose job it is to be a soldier, and they will be paid for their service. Moreover, if you serve for 20 years, when you retire from the ranks, you're then to be granted a parcel of land, basically to retire on, to live on, right? So you get pay and essentially kind of a retirement bonus of land. Solving the land problem. This has an added effect, right? Is that the soldiers become very closely tied to their general. Because this doesn't happen automatically. It requires, kind of on an annual basis, the general to kind of get legislation passed to get the land apportioned. So this means that for these soldiers, if they want to ensure that their arms and pay keep coming, and really if they want to get their retirement land, they need to make sure that their general is in a position to do it. In other words, military service starts to operate or look a little bit more like patronage. And that soldiers become increasingly loyal to their general than possibly to, we'll say, Rome as a whole. So here's a drawing again of kind of the new kind of Marian soldier, right? Decked out in all of their kind of campaign gear. Okay, questions here? Questions here? Anthony?
Sounds like Caesar.
Well, he is actually related to Julius Caesar. So, but yes, the connection will be made by others. All right. So, army reform, and again, this is going to be really successful. He is able to raise a huge number of troops in a relatively short period of time, bring them to Africa, right, and is going to win big against King Jugurtha. So his plan seems to be successful, right? So he goes to Africa, he finishes up the war there. And as he is kind of mopping up, there's going to be disaster in Transalpine Gaul. This is like very northern Italy now, where invading Germans have broken through the Roman ranks and are threatening Italy and even Rome itself. So, calling attention to this disaster, Marius says, well, there's only, Rome's in a time of crisis. I'm the only one, who's kind of capable, right, who has the experience to kind of turn back the Germans and save Rome. So, even though he had been consul in 107, he's going to be elected again in 104 with the mandate to go and fight the Germans. So again, this is not something that is supposed to happen. So technically, individuals are allowed to serve as consul for a second term, but it's supposed to be only 10 years after the end of their first term. This is only 3, so a very, very short period of time. Even more than that, he's actually elected in absentia, meaning that he's still in Africa, finishing up the war against Jugurtha. Normally you have to go and personally be in Rome to be elected. But He gets elected without even being there. He goes and fights the Germans. This goes on for several years. For the next following years, he's constantly going to be reelected consul again and again and again, right? Always in absentia, without returning to Rome. So at the end of the war in 100, right, he will have been elected consul an unprecedented 6 times, right? 5 of the times not actually being present in Rome. Okay, questions here? And also defeats the Germans.
The maximum you can get is 2 terms, right?
In theory, yes. So no one has ever had it more than 2 terms until Marius. All right, so the Germans are defeated, 100. All of a sudden, kind of the threat's done, and the people are really, the Roman elites are really kind of upset at Marius, right? They just saw him kind of running roughshod over the Roman constitution and kind of Roman political tradition, right? So they kind of basically lock up against him and try to stop him from getting whatever he wants. Well, the thing that he wants at this point is retirement land for his soldiers. He's got a bunch of soldiers who've been fighting for a couple of years, even over their 20-year period, right? They're supposed to get land to retire. No one in Rome, and I shouldn't say no one, but most people in Rome, among the Roman elite, don't want to support him. They don't want to help him anymore. So, getting desperate, he allies himself with a very extreme and rather violent tribune of the plebs. Someone who is looking really to kind of overturn the entire Roman system. So, the tactics that are adopted by his ally, which again basically involves lots of violence and threats and enemies disappearing, plus the fact that it doesn't actually turn out to be successful, means that Marius is going to end up being very unpopular, both among the Roman elites and even among, some of the more lower class Romans. So he is forced out of the public eye, goes into retirement, and pretty much disappears, at least for now. All right, that is it. Any last questions? That was pretty fast, actually. Any last questions? Mark? About what I mean, what? Oh, at least for now. He's going to disappear, but he will pop up again in the future. Somewhat surprisingly. He will come out of